So a combination of the warm air coming up from the south and the cold air coming down from the north, plus an already high spring tide, was the culmination of the Great Storm of 1953. The storm then travelled over 1,000 miles across Britain, claiming over 530 lives. It then went on to Holland, where it claimed a further 1,800. But the story we're going to be looking at is what happened here in this sea between Stranraer and Larne in Northern Ireland on that fateful day of the 31st of January 1953, where the Princess Victoria sank, claiming over 130 lives. To take us back, we're going to go meet Elaine Barton, the local historian. Hi Elaine.
Hello Janet.
Can you shed some light on the tragedy of the sinking of the Princess Victoria for us?
Of course I can, Janet. It's very significant because this is the 70th anniversary. It's 70 years, 31st of January 1953, since the Princess Victoria tragedy happened. In those days, it was a roll-on, roll-off ferry. And on the morning of the Princess Victoria, at 6:30, the legendary Paddy, that was the London train that came up from Euston, pulled
Why
into
do they
Street.
call that the Paddy?
The Paddy was called the Paddy because it was the Irish boat train. And so in the days before we had sort of cheap flights to Belfast and Londonderry, the train was where people travelled from, to and from Ireland. And of course, it's always been the shortest sea crossing. So on the morning of the 31st of January 1953, the legendary Paddy pulled in to the East Pier, Stranraer station, and my grandfather was actually driving the train that morning. Grandpa was an engine driver. He drove for LMS, and he watched as the passengers alighted up the gangplank. And of course, a lot of these people would never return, sadly. So apparently the storm, as we know, was very severe. There was sort of 80-mile-an-hour gales out in the loch, and seemingly the ship herself, she was actually rising and falling about 6 feet above the East Pier, even before she set sail. She was 45 minutes late in leaving that morning. That wasn't uncommon, however, because very often the actual London train from Euston, the Paddy, was late coming in. But on that morning, she was 45 minutes leaving, and it actually took her 45 minutes to get up the loch, very, very slow. It was dreadful. There was a heavy storm, severe gale. The wind, I believe, was blowing from the northwest. She reached the mouth of the loch, and just beyond it, Captain Ferguson, I think, made the decision that maybe it was too risky to continue the voyage, and so he decided that they should have outturned and retreat back into the safety of the As he was turning the vessel, the storm doors burst open. And of course, in those days, it was like a guillotine door, burst open, and the car deck started to flood.
On the 31st of January 1953, this is the very room Port Partick lifeboat crew were assembled, get prepared, ready to go to sea. So, the 31st of January 1953, the boat that went on that rescue was the Jeannie Spears. This here is a photo of the actual boat that went on the rescue that day. Jeannie Spears was on station here from 1937 to 1961. It's 67 launches with 18 lives saved. It's actually been a lifeboat in Port Partick since 1877, and the rescue of the Princess Victoria is the one that lives in the memory of everybody at this station.
On the morning that the Jeannie Spears received the call to go approximately 4 miles northwest of Corswell Point to the Princess Victoria, they would have sat in the same position here where we are located in the middle of the harbour. When departing from her moorings here in the harbour, I couldn't imagine what would be going through their heads when they went through the pier and turned round the Dorn Rock.
What I do remember was that because it was a Saturday, we sat down for a midday meal.
Right.
And my father went over to what we called in those days the wireless. It would now be a radio.
Yeah.
He went over and turned on the switch, and I distinctly remember it was, "This is the BBC Home Service. We are getting reports in that the cross-channel ferry from Stranraer to Larne has sent out an SOS message. We have no further details, but obviously we will keep listeners informed as we get more information." And that was, I remember my parents were really concerned because they would know people who were actually on that ferry.
I think the other thing that we've got to remember is that a lot of these people in the crew and the passengers had actually served in 2 world wars.
Yes.
Captain Ferguson served in the First World War. David Broadfoot, the radio operator, had served in the First World War.
Right.
Some of the women that were either passengers or working as crew had actually served in the Second World War. And it's interesting when you read, all about these individual people. Imagine they've survived some 2 world wars, some 1 world war, and then they meet
It's
their
the
death.
crossing.
It's the crossing. And also, what we've got to remember is that she was a significant presence in that harbour because she left from here every day at 7 o'clock. But she always came back to these piers. She always came back.
Right.
So it wasn't like maybe nowadays where sometimes the boats maybe are crossing Belfast. She always came home to Stranraer.
This was home.
This was home. And I think a lot of people that I've spoken to over the years, especially when I was in my early days in nursing, when there was still a lot of people who could remember the Princess Victoria, and talking to elderly people who I would often ask what were their memories, and that was one of the things that people would say. The fact that she was gone, she was no longer the presence of that boat was gone.
So there's even the grief of not having the physical boat.
presence of the Victoria. Yeah.
Because I guess those consistent things they bring, they give you a sense of security, don't
Absolutely, they do.
And so with that taken away, that is a loss in itself.
Huge amount of
on top of all the people who lost their lives.
Absolutely. But I think the important thing is that we never forget it.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your dad and what he was like? How did this shape him? What was his experience? Did he share stories?
He didn't share many stories. My mum says he was a changed man after it. Seemingly the two of them slid down the deck.
Right.
John lost a few fingers through scalps and that, and fell into the sea, and he had been lifted into a lifeboat.
Right.
People, he says there was no screaming, they were all calm. So they were. And there was actually some of the passengers asked him to go down to get their suitcases. And he went down and seemingly the water was up to his ankles.
I first saw her heading in the direction of Larne, and the wind was making heavy weather. The weather continued to get worse. When she went out of sight, she seemed to be on a line between Corswell Point and just north of Ballantrae.
As far as I know, he said the boat went down in 10 minutes.
Really, as quickly as that?
Mm-hmm.
So Billy, you were saying about this extra flight, and we've got some details here. So what was the date on there, did you say?
The date there.
The 5th or the 8th of February?
Aye, that was us dropping them dropping the route, no me.
No. So you had to stay home, well, back at base.
Back at base near traffic control to...
Right, for this flight. Was this a seaplane then that
Yes.
was going out?
Well, that was seaplane. There was the amphibians. Amphibian came from Belfast.
Right.
It
And
could-
these are the two planes then that came to
Well,
Dumfries?
they met over where the ship sank.
So then tell me about, you know, like the communications and how all that worked, and, you know, because it must have been very difficult being stuck out there at sea. So what was the setup?
Well, Kirkpatrick Lifeboat, Kirkpatrick radio station played a big part in the attempted rescue of the Princess Victoria. And that's where we sort of should mention David Broadfoot.
Right.
So David Broadfoot was the radio operator on board the Princess Victoria. And David Broadfoot had been at sea since the First World War time. He was a very experienced radio operator. David Broadfoot was eventually awarded the George Cross posthumously, and because he actually remained at his post with his Morse code and actually apologised, which at this stage he was probably knee deep in seawater, for the quality of his Morse code. And after obviously the tragedy, after he didn't survive, his son Billy and his wife were invited down to Buckingham Palace and were presented with his George Cross. And he decided that he would donate his George Cross to Stranraer Museum, where it remains now.
Oh, okay.
And there's actually a lovely photograph of Captain Ferguson's son, Jim Ferguson, and also Billy Broadfoot holding the George Cross.
Right.
The other thing is about the Sir Samuel Kelly. That was the lifeboat that was launched from Donaghadee. Now she managed to rescue 34 she picked up 34 survivors.
Right.
Because of the difficulty with communication and the fact that the Jeannie Spears, didn't initially, follow the course of path where the vessel was, because obviously she had drifted. They only managed to rescue two survivors. There was only two survivors on that lifeboat. There's quite a famous photograph of her returning to Kirkpatrick and some of the crew actually climbing up the metal ladder at Kirkpatrick Harbour, and a huge crowd there to meet the.
Right.
And I believe the coxswain of the lifeboat that day on the Jeannie Spears, I think he was a guy called William McConnell. He'd actually resigned from the lifeboat, I think about 4 or 5 days before, but he actually went out as the coxswain that day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about the guys going out on the lifeboats,
I know.
what they were going to face was
Sure.
unbelievable.
Absolutely.
Because lifeboats is not like going out in, Princess Victoria, for instance.
Absolutely
So
not.
they're risking their lives.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Amazing. The Sir Samuel Kelly, I believe, is still over over the water, and there has been a campaign over the years. I think the last I read in it, I think it was 2016, an article I read, but there has been campaigns to preserve it, because I think it's sat out somewhere, for a long time.
And we were talking earlier about, the place that the Princess Victoria held down at the pier.
Yeah.
And therefore in the hearts of the people in Stranraer.
Very much
the
so.
boat itself
Yeah.
was very much in the hearts of the people
It was
in the town.
her physical presence there,
The
as I
physical
said, the
presence.
physical presence of her being there first thing in the morning, and
You could
coming back
almost
at night.
check
Yeah.
your watch by it
Yeah,
and stuff.
absolutely.
And I suppose that's the bit that it brings that kind of peace to your life, like knowing that that's still there,
Yeah.
life is going just
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
But then you take that away,
Sure.
And that's a constant reminder of the tragedy that happened.
That she was gone, you know. And
She was gone, and so was a large
portion of the community.
Yeah. The Great Storm of 1953 and the tragedies that came in its wake have largely been forgotten in the history books. It was the year of the coronation of the Queen, and Europe was just coming out of the catastrophe of the Second World War. And this story didn't match the picture of progress and joy that was so desperately needed. But for the healing of these communities and their families, these stories must be remembered.